Chapter 1. The Impossible. Vanishing. It is with some hesitation that I begin the account of the Bluebell Inn affair. For though many of the cases in which I have assisted Sherlock Holmes contain features that might fairly be described as incredible, none have so thoroughly defied logic at first glance as the disappearance of Miss Marjorie Hartwood. Indeed, it was Holmes himself who would later remark that it was not the manner of the vanishing which baffled him, but the reason it had ever been believed possible. Our tale begins, as so many do, with the quiet arrival of a telegram at 221B Baker Street. It was late February, 1893. The skies above London hung low and grey, and the streets glistened with thawing sleet. Holmes had been in one of his more contemplative moods, refusing breakfast and spending the morning in near-complete silence, save for the occasional pluck of his violin. The missive arrived shortly after noon. I opened it at Mrs. Hudson's urging, as Holmes was far too engaged in boiling a piece of cloth in acid to respond. "Urgent stop missing guest. From locked room stop. No trace left behind. Stop police unable to explain. Stop Bluebell in Hampshire. Stop, please come immediately." Stoppy read the telegram aloud. Holmes did not respond at once. He peered at the fabric boiling in the flask with his usual intensity, then lifted it with tweezers and held it up to the window light. "Watson," he said mildly, "do you observe any irregularities in this weave?" No," I admitted. "Exactly," he said, tossing it aside. "No irregularities whatsoever. It is entirely uninteresting, unlike the case you've just read. A disappearance, you say?" From a locked room, Holmes's eyes sparkled. "Now, that," he said, "is a far more promising proposition." Within the hour, he had summoned a hansom cab and thrown a valise together with more efficiency than I had seen from him in weeks. "Bring your revolver, Watson," he added as we prepared to depart. "It is most likely unnecessary, but I have found that when dealing with impossibilities, one should not disregard the improbable." Our journey to Hampshire took us through sullen countryside and past slumbering hedgerows still rimmed with frost. It was dusk when we arrived in the quiet village of Elcombe, where the Bluebell Inn stood at the edge of a hollow, its windows aglow and chimney issuing steady smoke. The establishment had an air of age, but was tidy and solidly built. 2 stories with ivy creeping up the eastern wall and a blue-painted sign swinging gently in the wind. We were met at the door by Mr. Crispin Toller, the innkeeper, a man of ample build and apologetic bearing. His eyes were deeply shadowed, and his fingers trembled as he gestured us inside. "You must be Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson," he asked. I scarcely believed you'd come so quickly." Holmes removed his gloves with deliberate care. "You say a guest has disappeared?" Toller nodded, leading us to a private sitting room where the fire was already crackling. "Miss Marjorie Hartwood. A quiet lady, well-spoken. She'd come for a week's rest and research. Said she was writing an article on local folklore. Had the northeast room, best view in the house. She came down for supper the night before last, perfectly calm. Returned to her room afterward, and was never seen again. No one saw her. Leave? No, sir. And here's the strange part. Her door was locked from the inside the next morning. We broke it down. She was gone. No sign of struggle. Her bag, her coat, her boots, all still there. Window bolted. No other exit." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "What did the police conclude?" that she must have left during the night, and someone relocked the door from outside. But that's just it. There's no way to do it. The bolt's internal. You have to be inside to slide it. Holmes steepled his fingers. And there was no scent of perfume, no lingering cologne, no trace of a second visitor. Toller blinked. I don't know, sir. Then it is fortunate, Holmes said quietly, that I intend to find out. Within minutes we were led upstairs, where Holmes examined the room in question with the detachment of a man surveying an abandoned stage. The bed was made, the carpet unruffled. Her writing desk held 2 open books and a closed ink bottle. A single lamp burned beside the mirror. Everything was in place, too perfectly. Holmes moved like a bloodhound, crouching by the door, lifting the latch, testing the bolt, and then crossing to the window to inspect the sill. He sniffed the curtains, removed the coverlet from the bed, and examined the floorboards in silence. Then, without a word, he knelt at the fireplace and reached inside. He withdrew a charred scrap of ribbon, singed at one end and smelling faintly, of camphor. He held it to the light. "Curious," he murmured. "Watson, what do you make of it?" I examined it. Part of a lady's garment, perhaps? Perhaps, or perhaps something ceremonial. Toller, watching from the doorway, shifted uneasily. "Is it a clue, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes smiled faintly. "It is a start." He placed the ribbon into his coat pocket. Then, glancing once more at the closed window, he whispered, "She did not vanish into thin air. Someone made her vanish." And with that, he turned on his heel and said, "Now, Watson, let us speak with the other guests." So began one of the strangest and most cerebral cases Holmes had ever accepted. A locked-room mystery in a country inn, involving no sound, no struggle, and no exit. Only the silence of a room that should not have been empty, and the faint scent of ether in the air. Chapter 2. Holmes receives the case. We took our supper late that evening in the Bluebell Inn's modest dining hall. The air held a curious stillness, as though the building itself were reluctant to speak of what had transpired within its walls. A single kerosene lamp swung gently overhead, casting elongated shadows upon the oak-panelled walls, and the fire crackled in the grate like the ticking of an invisible clock, counting down the moments since Marjorie Hartwood's inexplicable vanishing. Holmes ate little, as was his habit during the early stages of an investigation, content instead to sip weak tea and stare into the flames, occasionally drumming his fingers upon the table in some private rhythm of thought. I, more practical, had accepted the innkeeper's offer of lamb stew, and was just mopping up the last of the broth when Inspector Jonathan Larchmont of the Hampshire Constabulary arrived. He was a narrow, angular man of perhaps 40, with thinning hair, a beaked nose, and an expression of perpetual suspicion, as if the world had once tricked him, and he had resolved never to be caught unaware again. "Mr. Holmes," he greeted curtly, removing his gloves but not his coat. "Dr. Watson." Holmes inclined his head. "Inspector." Larchmont sat at our invitation, but kept his spine stiff and his tone clipped. "I see you've wasted no time. I had not expected you until morning." "I rarely sleep well when something illogical is afoot," Holmes replied, and vanishing women in sealed rooms disturb my equilibrium." Larchmont did not smile. "I do hope you haven't come to interfere." "I have come to observe, Inspector. Should I find anything worth interfering in, I'll be sure to consult you first." The tension between them crackled like dry kindling. I felt the need to intercede. "Tell us, Inspector, what is your working theory?" Larchmont gave a small, annoyed sniff. "Miss Hartwood left the room during the night. Somehow. We believe the bolt on the door was engaged after her disappearance. Perhaps by an accomplice, perhaps by some trick with a cord or tool slid under the door. She may have suffered a mental break and fled into the woods. She has no known family, only a publisher in London, and no signs of enemies. I've sent word to nearby hospitals and sanatoria." Holmes tilted his head. "And the bolt? Have you tried recreating the locking method?" "We have. No implement we've tested is long or supple enough to engage the bolt from outside. The door frame is snug, and the gap beneath is too narrow. The window, as you saw, is fastened from within with an iron latch. It would require immense precision to re-engage it from outside without damage. There is no ledge beneath it." "And what of the scent?" Larchmont blinked. "Scent?" Holmes leaned forward slightly, fingertips together. There was a faint trace of camphor and ether in the room. Larchmont frowned. "I did not detect it." "You would not. It had already faded, but it was there. Ether is not commonly used by women writing folklore articles." The inspector grew defensive. "It could have been residue from a cleaning. Solution. Possibly, but a solution one does not apply to silk ribbon, certainly." Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew the charred scrap he had collected from the hearth. This was partially burned, and intentionally so, I believe. It's not part of her clothing. Rather, something more ceremonial. Possibly something concealed or meant to be discarded. Larchmont took the ribbon and examined it through narrowed eyes. "It tells us little." "Perhaps not yet," Holmes said quietly. "But the fire is often the place where people attempt to erase things. Photographs, letters, items with meaning." I could see that Larchmont's patience was thinning. "I've had enough of riddles," the inspector said. "Do you believe foul play is involved or not?" Holmes answered after a pause. "Not in the usual sense. No blood, no forced entry, no theft. But Miss Hartwood did not leave of her own volition. Of that I am sure." He turned to me. "Watson, you recall the 2 books upon her writing desk?" I nodded. "Yes. One was Superstitions of the Southern Parishes. The other, a copy of Bishop Ward's treatise on pagan vestiges." "Indeed. Both volumes deal with rural traditions. Harvest rites, saint days, seasonal myths. And the Bluebell Inn has stood since the 17th century on land once used for midsummer gathering." Larchmont raised an eyebrow. "You think this is some country ritual?" "No," Holmes said flatly. "I think someone wants it to appear that way." There was a moment of silence. The fire hissed. Larchmont folded the ribbon and handed it back to Holmes. "I've assigned a man to watch the woods. But frankly, I don't hold much hope. If you find something useful, you know where to reach me." He stood abruptly and left the room, his boots tapping sharply on the flagstones. Holmes waited until the door shut behind him, then turned to me with the faintest trace of amusement. "Did you note his hands, Watson?" "His hands?" "Clean, nails, no calluses, but 2 small flecks of ash beneath his left cuff. He examined the fireplace before we arrived and discarded something. I wonder what. I looked toward the hearth. Shall we search it? Later. For now, we need to speak with the staff and guests. We must understand not just who disappeared, but who was meant to see it. As Holmes rose and retrieved his coat, I felt the first true chill of the mystery settle in. Miss Hartwood had vanished without a trace. But Holmes had begun to find echoes, and it is in echoes, he once told me, that ghosts sometimes speak. Chapter 3. A Scene of Deception. The morning light at the Bluebell Inn did little to dispel the heaviness of the atmosphere. Though the hearth was warm and the scent of fresh bread wafted from the kitchen, there lingered a tension in the hallways, an unease so palpable that even the usual creaks of the floorboards seemed to tread more softly than before. Holmes rose, early and after a single cup of black coffee, and a silence that stretched for nearly an hour, led me upstairs to Miss Hartwood's room once more. "We shall begin again," he murmured, unlocking the door with the innkeeper's master key, but this time with clear heads and without interruption. The room had not changed. The writing desk still held the 2 books, the ink bottle sat closed, and the small travel bag lay at the foot of the bed, its leather buckled and worn with use. Holmes moved immediately to the desk and began inspecting it, not as one might study furniture, but as if it were a witness to be cross-examined. "Observe, Watson," he said, motioning to the spine of Bishop Ward's treatise. "There is a crease midway down the spine, uneven, as though the book were pressed shut hastily. Not unusual on its own. But then compare it to the other volume, Superstitions of the Southern Parishes, which lies open and uncreased. It suggests this book was closed recently, perhaps even moments before her disappearance. I bent to examine it myself. The book bore marginalia in a tidy, looping hand, clearly Miss Hartwood's. One note in particular caught my attention. The hollow at Briar's Edge. See ledger of Reverend Elliston. Said to be sealed by 1819, Edge, I repeated aloud. A wooded rise west of the inn, Holmes replied without looking up. Known in local tales for sightings and folk ceremonies. A curious place to study. He turned to the wardrobe next, sliding the door open gently. Within hung 2 dresses, both simple but neatly maintained. Beneath them were a pair of boots, mud-caked at the heel, and an umbrella with a crooked handle. Holmes lifted the boots and examined their soles. She had been walking recently, and not merely along the gravel drive. Note the red earth. It matches the clay in the lower copse. I was about to respond when he held up one finger and stepped toward the window. He knelt and ran a hand along the sill. Then he did something curious. He turned his back to the window, crouched, and looked into the room as though from the perspective of someone entering from outside. "What do you see, Watson?" "A tidy chamber," I said. "Books, ink, a closed bag. It gives no hint of distress, precisely, and that is the deception." He rose. "Now consider the bolt, Watson. It is iron, with a brass tab. It shows no scratches, no damage, and no bending of the internal tongue. Would you agree?" I nodded. "It seems perfectly sound." "So, we must conclude it was engaged from within. But if no one left by the door, and no one could rebolt it from the outside, then she must have still been here. or have left by another means. The window? He shook his head. Too narrow and far too high. No rope marks, no shifted curtain rod. Which brings us to a third possibility. I waited. He said nothing. Well, I pressed, that someone made it appear she vanished, when, in fact, she did not. A knock at the door interrupted our exchange. It was Mr. Toller, the innkeeper, hat in hand and eyes wide. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen, I thought you might want to speak with the maid, Elsie. She's downstairs. Seems shaken." We followed him to the kitchen, where a girl of perhaps 18 sat pale-faced and wringing her hands in her apron. She stood as we entered. "Miss Elsie," Holmes said gently, "you were the last person to see Miss Hartwood." The girl nodded. "Yes, sir. I took up her tea the night before she went." "What time was that?" "Just past 9, sir. She always had tea and a bit of honey bread. She thanked me, real polite, and said she'd be writing late." "Did you notice anything unusual?" The girl hesitated. "Well, she seemed different that night. Not frightened exactly, but distracted. She didn't meet my eyes, and her hands, they were shaking a bit when she took the tray." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Did you see anyone else near her room?" She glanced at Toller, who gave a reassuring nod. "There was someone," she said. "A man. I don't know his name, but I saw him on the landing just as I was leaving. Dark coat, wide hat, stood very still. I thought he was one of the guests, but I didn't recognize him. Could he have been a local? Maybe. He looked wrong, though, like he didn't belong." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And you told no one this?" I was frightened. After she went missing, I didn't want to be blamed." Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then, with surprising gentleness, he said, "You've done the right thing now. Thank you." We stepped back into the hallway. Holmes paused, glancing up the staircase. "Watson," he said softly, "this case is no longer merely a disappearance. It is a performance." A performance? Yes. A locked room. A vanished woman. A mysterious figure in the shadows. But nothing has been stolen. Nothing has been broken. Everything is arranged. He reached into his pocket and retrieved the singed ribbon once more. And until we know what this was meant to hide, we are dancing with a ghost of someone else's making. As the bell above the inn door jingled faintly in the distance, and the cold wind whistled in through the eaves, I could not help but shudder. For the first time in many months, I feared that Holmes had entered a mystery where even logic might not be enough. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. The dining room of the Bluebell Inn had, that afternoon, been hastily converted into a makeshift sitting chamber, its modest tables pushed back against the walls, and a kettle set to boil on the sideboard. Inspector Larchmont had returned, accompanied by a constable, and at Holmes's firm suggestion had agreed to gather every guest and staff member present on the night of Miss Hartwood's disappearance. It was, as Holmes noted sotto voce, a peculiar collection of faces, none of them outwardly criminal, and yet each seemed cloaked in an air of reserve. The still unspoken possibility that one among them knew more than they admitted lent a tremor to every polite cough or fidgeted teacup. There were 5 guests in all, in addition to Mr. Toller and his niece Elsie. Holmes took his time observing them from across the room before quietly drawing me aside. "We shall approach this like a chessboard," he murmured. Everyone is in place, but not all understand the rules or the stakes. We shall provoke their opening moves." The first to step forward at Holmes's mild invitation was Mr. Archibald Renfield, a gentleman of about 50, with gaunt features, and the gait of someone long accustomed to self-importance. "I am here on business," he said briskly. "Solicitor by trade. I was in my room the entire evening reading. I heard nothing unusual. Holmes offered no challenge, but merely asked, 'You dined alone, I presume?' I did. The roast was overdone." "A tragedy indeed," Holmes replied dryly. Next came Miss Thelma Clay, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and a velvet collar pinned with a cameo. She spoke with precision, each word seeming to emerge only after strict internal approval. "I came to the Bluebell Inn for the quiet," she said. "I write articles for the Ladies' Journal, on embroidery." "Were you acquainted with Miss Hartwood?" "I spoke to her once in the drawing-room. She was pleasant, if somewhat preoccupied. We discussed ghost stories." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Indeed. Did she mention any particular story?" "She said she was researching the Briar's Edge Hollow. Said she'd come across something in the parish records that couldn't possibly be true." I asked what she meant, but she only smiled. "Thank you, Miss Clay. You've been very helpful." The third guest, Mr. Lionel Peck, was a nervous man, in spectacles, his tie askew and his fingers trembling against the rim of his teacup. I didn't speak to her," he said quickly. "Didn't even see her properly. I'm a schoolmaster from Portsmouth, here to recover from a fever. I was in bed with a compress most of the day." "Were you aware of anyone entering or leaving the upstairs corridor after nightfall?" I heard footsteps. A creak on the stair around 10, I think. Could have been anything." The fourth was Mrs. Renly, a widow of some advanced age with sharp blue eyes and a cane of lacquered walnut. Despite her age, she exuded vitality. "That girl was too clever for her own good," she pronounced when asked about Miss Hartwood. "Always scribbling notes and wandering into the woods. A fox eventually meets the hounds." "A curious turn of phrase," Holmes said. "Did you find her disagreeable?" "I found her secretive. And secrecy attracts trouble." The final guest was Mr. Osric Dane, a broad-shouldered, taciturn man with heavy boots and a face like carved granite. He identified himself as a travelling stone-cutter on his way to work at a cathedral site in Exeter. "She asked me questions," he said gruffly. "What sort of questions?" Holmes prompted. "About stones, standing ones. Told her I wasn't local and didn't care for talk of druids." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Did she mention the phrase Briar's Edge?" Osric's eye twitched, almost imperceptibly. "Maybe. Can't recall." Holmes let it pass. Once all the guests had spoken, Holmes turned his attention briefly to Mr. Toller and young Elsie. Their accounts were much as before, though Holmes drew particular attention to Elsie's mention of the man in the dark coat seen near the landing. Toller denied seeing anyone unusual. When all had been heard, Larchmont rose. "We have 5 guests and 2 staff who claim no involvement. No one saw her leave. No one heard a cry or a struggle. It is an impossibility." Holmes spoke quietly from his chair. "On the contrary, Inspector, it is a perfectly crafted possibility." He stood and addressed the room. "Someone here, at this very inn, knew Marjorie Hartwood's mind. Someone heard what she was uncovering and understood its danger. That person either wished to frighten her, silence her, or make it appear that she had simply vanished. A silence followed his words. All eyes glanced about the room, some defensive, some curious, a few glinting with anxiety. Holmes observed it all with hawk-like focus. "Until we know who she was truly speaking to," he said, "and what she discovered in those records, we are groping in fog. But make no mistake, Miss Hartwood's disappearance was not magic, nor madness. It was method." He gave a short bow and withdrew to the far end of the room. I followed. "You saw something," I murmured. He nodded. 3 things, in fact. Mr. Renfield had ink on his sleeve, yet claims he spent the evening reading. Miss Clay quoted Miss Hartwood's words precisely, despite claiming a brief conversation. And Mr. Dane's boots, wet mud, not red clay. He wasn't in the woods behind the inn. He came from the riverbank. What does it mean? It means, Holmes said softly, that each of them is lying, but only one of them had reason to make her disappear. He turned to glance once more at the ribbon in his hand, still faintly singed. "And I suspect," he said, "that the ribbon belongs to none of them." Chapter 5. The Convenient Suspect. The following morning dawned grey and bitter, with a fine mist clinging to the hedgerows and drifting like smoke along the lanes. Holmes stood at the window of our modest room at the Bluebell Inn, watching the fog gather on the moorland beyond. His violin remained untouched in its case, a sure sign of his mental immersion in the case. Inspector Larchmont arrived just after breakfast, with a look of quiet triumph beneath his moustache. "I believe we may have a resolution," he said, placing a small cloth-wrapped bundle on the table. Holmes did not turn from the window. "Do go on, Inspector." "The dark-coated figure seen near Miss Hartwood's room has been identified," Larchmont announced. "A local fellow named Gregory Phipps. Bit of a vagabond, odd in the head. He was seen loitering near the inn days prior, and has a history of pestering women. We picked him up near the riverbank." He unwrapped the bundle to reveal a girl's brooch, an antique silver piece with a small lapis centre, recognized by Toller as one worn by Miss Hartwood, found in Phipps's coat pocket. Watson and I exchanged a glance. Holmes finally turned, his gaze sharp. "Convenient," he said simply. Larchmont bristled. "Convenient, perhaps, but damning nonetheless. The man cannot explain how the brooch came into his possession." "And his explanation?" Holmes asked. "He says he found it on the road to the church and picked it up." "A not impossible story," Holmes mused, "but far too simple. Simplicity in a mystery often conceals greater complexity." He reached into his coat and retrieved the ribbon once more. "You've seen this, I presume?" Larchmont nodded. "From her room, yes. A scorched end. Could mean nothing. A candle, perhaps." "Or something removed in great haste," Holmes said. "Torn from a journal, used to mark a passage, and cast into the hearth to hide its origin. Tell me, Inspector, did your Mr. Phipps carry matches?" "No," Larchmont admitted. "He had a bit of flint and a dull blade. No signs of a fire." Holmes turned away again. "Then he did not burn the ribbon. He did not enter through the window. He did not scale the ivy. And the door, locked from within, remains a puzzle only solvable by someone with knowledge of the inn's interior. I doubt your vagrant has such architectural insight. Larchmont shifted uncomfortably. We'll hold him regardless, he muttered. The evidence is sufficient. For Scotland Yard, perhaps, Holmes murmured, but not for the truth. Later, that day, Holmes asked to walk the path to the churchyard, the same road on which Phipps claimed to have found the brooch. We passed the lane that led to Briar's Edge, where the trees grew more thickly, and the red clay of the hillside could be seen in patches beneath the mist. You do not believe Phipps is guilty, I said, breaking our silence. No, Holmes replied, but someone wishes us to. That is what concerns me most. We reached the small church, St. Bartholomew's, an old stone building leaning gently westward with age. The graveyard behind it sloped down into a hollow filled with elder, bushes and broken stones. A curious place, remote and seemingly forgotten. Inside, the parish records were kept in a cabinet behind the pulpit. The Reverend, a dishevelled but kind man named Avery, granted Holmes permission to examine the logs Miss Hartwood had reportedly studied. Holmes flipped through the ledger quickly, but methodically. Then he paused. Watson, I came to his side. He pointed to a page dated 1819. The ink had faded, but a particular entry stood out. Interred, Edith Elliston. Cause of death, self-inflicted wound. Circumstances sealed at request of family. See attached note. Reverend G.H. Beneath this, the paper bore faint scorch marks. Someone had once attempted to burn the adjoining note. Holmes closed the ledger gently. She found this, he said. She may have found the note itself. That is what the ribbon marked. And someone else found her discovery. Inconvenient. As we exited the church, I felt the wind shift. The mist had lifted slightly, revealing the slope of Briar's Edge rising to our left. Holmes stopped and looked toward it thoughtfully. I believe, he said slowly, that Miss Hartwood's disappearance has little to do with passion or jealousy, and everything to do with something buried in this valley's history. She found a truth that someone had taken great pains to hide, and she paid the price for uncovering it. Back at the inn, Elsie greeted us with wide eyes and a lowered voice. "He's gone," she whispered. "Mr. Renfield. He left without paying. Said he'd received urgent news and must be off." Holmes's gaze darkened. "Did he leave anything behind?" "Just a scarf. And, well, I think he tried to burn some papers in the stove. Toller says the ashes were still warm when he went to set the fire for supper." "Show me," Holmes said, in the small sitting room. Holmes knelt by the hearth and used a poker to stir the cooled embers. He retrieved several fragments, burnt edges of fine paper, a curled corner of something that may have once borne a family crest. He examined them silently. "Mr. Renfield," he said at last, "is no mere solicitor. He is connected to this history, perhaps to the Elliston family itself. I must know more." "What do we do now?" I asked. "We let Larchmont chase his ghost," Holmes said. "Meanwhile, we follow the footprints he cannot see. Someone laid the brooch in Phipps's coat. Someone staged that ribbon, and someone is playing a careful game, one which is only just beginning to reveal its stakes." He turned to the window and stared out into the darkening moor. "Prepare yourself, Watson. The second act is about to begin." Chapter 6. The Ribbon's Message. The fire had burned low, casting long flickers across the walls of the Bluebell Inn sitting room. When Holmes returned from his brief solitary walk in the woods beyond Briar Edge, I had remained inside, combing my notes and attempting to reconcile the contradictions that multiplied with each turn of the investigation. Yet the rhythm of the case, I knew, followed Holmes's inner tempo, and that tempo had now quickened. He entered with wind-coarsened cheeks and a leaf snagged in the fold of his coat. Without speaking, he went straight to the desk in the corner, struck a match, and lit the oil lamp. "I've found where the ribbon leads," he said. "Leads?" I repeated, rising. "You mean it wasn't merely a page marker?" "No," Holmes replied, his fingers busy retrieving the scorched ribbon. "From his pocket. It was a signal, a message." I watched as he unfurled the remnant on the desk. In the yellow lamplight, the charred edge now revealed a faint trace of ink, nearly invisible before, but legible under close inspection. "Will not rest. The truth of Elliston Hollow must, if I disappear, seek beneath the elder." Holmes's eyes gleamed. She left this as insurance. A last note, an unfinished clue. I felt a coldness prick at my spine. Elliston Hollow, that's the dip behind the churchyard, where the ground sags beneath the graves. Holmes nodded. "And the elder bushes grow wild there, dense and overgrown." Miss Hartwood knew someone might try to silence her. She feared it enough to write this and conceal it within a journal. One I suspect is now ash in the inn's hearth. "Then we must return to the church," I said. "Not yet," Holmes replied. "We'll draw too much attention in daylight. And our adversary has already shown. They're adept at preempting our movements. We must first re-examine the connections between our suspects, and find out which of them had cause to bury a secret in that hollow." That afternoon, Holmes took pains to speak privately with each remaining guest at the inn, using the guise of casual curiosity to press at the edges of their memories and alibis. I accompanied him, observing the dance with increasing fascination. Miss Clay, the embroidery writer, now showed signs of subtle unease. When Holmes inquired again about her conversation with Miss Hartwood, she faltered slightly. "She was curious about an old scandal," she said. "A suicide, I believe. Something in the local annals." "Did she mention any names?" Holmes asked gently. "No, or if she did, I've forgotten." She bit her lip. "There was something about land, disputed ownership, I think. It was all rather tangled." Holmes let her go without further comment. As she left the parlour, he murmured, "She's concealing something. Whether from guilt or fear, I cannot yet say." Next came Mr. Osric Dane, the stonecutter. Holmes inquired about his movements the night of the disappearance, and Dane answered in gruff, clipped tones. "I was in the tap-room till near 10, he said. Then I went to my room, heard nothing, slept through the night." "No walk to the river?" Holmes asked. "Not that night. But your boots were wet," Holmes said, almost conversationally. "From the reeds near the southern bank, I should think. Not from the inn's road where the ground is dry clay." Dane bristled. "I mind my own affairs." "As do I," Holmes said calmly, "which is why I'm certain your boots will appear again in this matter." Later, as the sun dipped low and shadows crept across the wainscoting of the Bluebell's halls, Holmes requested Elsie's presence once more. "Cherdidadoo told us you saw a figure near Miss Hartwood's door," he began. "Think carefully. What did you notice? A sound? A smell?" Elsie, pale and hesitant, nodded slowly. It smelled faintly of pipe smoke. Not tobacco, though. Sweeter, like cloves. Holmes's expression sharpened. "You're sure? Used to help in my uncle's storeroom," she said. "I know the smell of clove tobacco. It was strong, just for a moment, then gone." When Elsie departed, Holmes turned to me with a quiet certainty. "None of our suspects smokes clove tobacco," he said. "At least none who admit it. Which means one of them is not who they appear to be, or someone else was here that night." He withdrew to the desk again and laid out our gathered notes, arranging the fragments like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. He pointed to the name. Edith Elliston, Marjorie Hartwood, found something damning about this woman's death. Something powerful, enough to threaten someone here. Perhaps a descendant. Perhaps someone connected to the church or the land. "And Renfield?" I asked. "You still believe his sudden departure was tied to this?" "Absolutely. He burned something in that stove. He fled without notice. And I've since confirmed that the Elliston name appears in a case he once handled. An inheritance dispute in Somerset 10 years ago. He wasn't merely vacationing. He came to find what Marjorie had already uncovered." Outside, the mist was rising again. Holmes stood. "It's time, Watson. Tonight we go to the Hollow. Whatever is buried beneath those elder bushes, papers, relics, or bones, Miss Hartwood meant for someone to find it if she vanished. Let us not disappoint her." Chapter 7. A voice beneath the earth. It was past midnight when Holmes and I set out from the Bluebell Inn, cloaked in silence and mist. The moon hung behind a gauze of clouds, lending the path before us a spectral pallor. We carried only a lantern and a spade, for Holmes was determined that we should disturb as little as possible, lest our nocturnal pursuit be noticed by any still wakeful eyes. We reached Elliston Hollow in silence. The church loomed behind us, its crooked steeple barely visible above the hillock, while before us the ground dipped into a basin thick with elder bushes and broken gravestones, many leaning, some collapsed entirely. Time had not been kind to the dead in this place. Holmes led the way, moving with an unnatural surety, his lantern swinging low and steady. "She said to seek beneath the elder," he muttered, "and she was a woman who chose her words with care." We stopped at a gnarled clump of elder trees that rose like a twisted claw from the centre of the hollow, their roots coiled over a half-submerged slab of slate. Holmes crouched and brushed back the leaf mould. A name emerged from the grime. Edith Elliston born, 1796. Died 1809. Holmes did not hesitate. He struck the edge of the shovel into the soil, just beside the grave's headstone. "We dig," he said simply. Though the ground was soft, our work was tense. I could feel the hush of the church pressing on us from behind, the cold breath of some ancient judgment heavy on our backs. After 20 minutes of steady effort, the spade clinked against something firmer than soil. Holmes knelt and scraped, gently. A small iron strongbox, heavily rusted and thick with grime, emerged from the earth. He pried it open with the tip of the spade. Inside wrapped in oilskin and twine, were papers, old, yellowed, and neatly folded. Holmes handled them as though they were sacred texts, inspecting the first page with a narrowing of the eyes. "A journal," he said, "written by Edith herself. The script is faint, but unmistakable." He handed the lantern to me and read silently for a long minute, turning pages slowly. Then he spoke, low and taut. "She had a child, Watson." "A child?" Holmes nodded. "A daughter, born out of wedlock, conceived with a man of influence, though the name is deliberately omitted." He flipped another page. "She was pressured to give up the child to a foundling hospital in London. When she refused, her family had her confined here, under the pretence of melancholy madness, a shameful secret to be buried with her." "And the suicide? She did not take her life. She wrote of threats of feeling watched and, most chillingly, of being forced to write a confession under duress." The journal ends abruptly. He closed the book, eyes distant. Miss Hartwood must have found a reference to this story, possibly even this very box. Her interest in parish records, her questions about inheritance, land claims, they all converge here. A branch cracked in the distance. Holmes extinguished the lantern with a sharp puff. We crouched in the dark. A figure moved at the crest of the hill, barely outlined against the murky sky. It paused, looked down into the hollow, and then retreated silently. When the footsteps had faded, Holmes relit the lantern and reburied the strongbox, placing it precisely as we had found it. "They'll return," he said grimly. "And when they do, they must find nothing missing, yet believe they have not gone unnoticed." We returned to the inn just before dawn. I could barely keep my eyes open, but Holmes remained alert, pacing slowly in the common room as the hearth crackled. "Lo, I now understand the motive," he said. "This is no crime of passion or impulse. It is a decades-old concealment, one Miss Hartwood unwittingly disturbed." "You believe someone here is descended from the Elliston line?" I asked. "Perhaps. Or connected through inheritance. You remember the solicitor, Renfield? He handled a claim on land near Elliston Hollow. If a living heir to Edith's child were to emerge, they might stake a claim to that property." "Precisely," Holmes said, "and perhaps more. If her union had noble or financial significance, the entire family line could be imperilled." He paused by the fire, staring into its glow. "Someone learned Miss Hartwood was close to uncovering the truth. They panicked. They tried to silence her, and then arranged a scapegoat in Gregory Phipps. I stood slowly. But if she isn't dead—" Holmes turned. "Then she may yet be found. And the person who took her would have to be someone with access, cunning, and motive. Someone close." There was a knock at the door. Holmes opened it to reveal Inspector Larchmont, haggard, wet with fog, and visibly rattled. "There's been another development," he said. "Mr. Dane was attacked on the footpath below Briar's Edge, clubbed from behind. He's unconscious, and something's been taken from his coat." Holmes's expression turned to iron. "The game," he said, "is moving faster than I anticipated." Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. Inspector Larchmont's breath still fogged in the chill air as we hastily donned our coats and followed him back toward the footpath beneath Briar's Edge. The sky was paling, the first suggestion of dawn creeping. up from behind the hilltops, though the fog lay heavy over the land like a veil, softening edges and muting sound. We found Osric Dane slumped against a dry stone wall, a thick bandage hastily applied to his temple. A constable stood beside him, offering a flask of brandy. "He's concussed," Larchmont muttered. "We found him staggering from the hedgerow, dazed and half-conscious. His coat was torn open, and he said someone rifled through the inner pocket." Holmes knelt beside Dane, examining the wound with swift efficiency. The stonecutter's face was sallow, and his speech thick with confusion. "Did you see who struck you?" Holmes asked quietly. Dane winced. "No, just a rush of air, and then stars." "You said something was taken?" "A letter," Dane croaked. "It were nothing. Something I picked up weeks ago. Didn't even read it. Just thought it might mean something to someone." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Where did you get it?" "Church sale," Dane mumbled. "Box of old odds. Thought it might be worth papering a window. But the name, it caught my eye. Hartwood." Muir stood abruptly. So someone else learned he had it, and moved swiftly to retrieve it. We must assume, then, that Dane inadvertently came into possession of correspondence vital to the disappearance. "What now?" Larchmont asked, grim. "We let them believe they have succeeded," Holmes said, "but the truth is already coalescing. We must now provoke the adversary into revealing themselves." Back at the Bluebell Inn, Holmes resumed his characteristic silence, broken only by the scratch of his pen or the rustle of pages. I could tell his mind was turning over the events with relentless precision. After a late breakfast, during which the guests made half-hearted attempts at conversation, Holmes rose and addressed the room. "My apologies for the disturbance last night," he said mildly. "Inspector Larchmont tells me Mr. Dane was assaulted. A most unsettling development." A few murmurs followed, but it was the reaction of the guests that drew Holmes's keen attention. Miss Clay had gone pale. Mrs. Cranley dropped her teacup. Even Reverend Trullo, who had thus far been the picture of stony composure, appeared rattled. Holmes's gaze swept them briefly. "In light of this, I've asked Inspector Larchmont to remain in the area. I believe we are closer to the truth than we may know." With that, he retired once more to his room, motioning for me to follow. "I shall test them now, Watson," he said once the door closed behind us. "How? By revealing something false. A calculated fiction. If our adversary reacts, it will confirm their identity." An hour later, Holmes gathered all the guests in the sitting room. The hearth was lit, casting warm light across the aged wallpaper and the guests' strained faces. Holmes stood beside the mantel, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I thank you for your patience. I believe I owe you some clarity." The room went still. "We have located Miss Hartwood," Holmes announced. "She is alive and in police custody, having been found late last night near Cheltenham. She is confused but unharmed, and we believe she was abducted by someone posing as a carriage driver." A ripple passed through the room. Miss Clay exhaled sharply. Reverend Trullo gripped the arms of his chair. Mrs. Cranley turned ashen. Holmes continued smoothly. "Before her disappearance, she confided in someone here, someone she believed could be trusted. That trust, tragically, was misplaced. Fortunately, She managed to record her suspicions in a sealed letter. He paused. We have recovered that letter. No one spoke. It was as though the very air thickened with dread. Holmes let the silence linger, then gave a slight nod. The person she named will be speaking to Inspector Larchman shortly. I suggest, in the interest of decency, that they come forward. Still, no one moved. Holmes bowed his head. Very well. Later, once the guests had dispersed, some hurriedly, others numbly, Holmes and I returned to our private quarters. "She is not found, is she?" I asked. "No," he replied, "but the reaction told me far more than words. Reverend Trullo, did you see how his gaze flickered not to me but to Miss Clay?" "I did," I said slowly. "Do you suspect a connection?" "I suspect much more. Miss Clay, I now believe, was the last person to speak to Miss Hartwood before she vanished, and Reverend Trullo is hiding something, not just from us, but from her. Whether they act in concert or conflict remains unclear." He opened his casebook and scribbled a few notes, then circled 2 names. "I must divide our suspects," he said. "We cannot afford to approach them as a group any longer. I shall speak privately with Trullo tomorrow. In the meantime, Watson, I ask you to observe Miss Clay. Discreetly. Note whom she speaks to, where she goes, and if she attempts to leave." Holmes looked up with a rare glint of steel in his eyes. "Then, my dear fellow, we follow." Chapter 9. The Culprit Strikes Again. Though Holmes had carefully staged his fictional declaration of Miss Hartwood's recovery, the responses it elicited cast new light upon the players in this grim affair. Yet it was not the reactions alone that troubled Holmes. It was the timing. For if our unknown adversary believed the letter naming them had been recovered, they would feel pressed to act swiftly, either to secure their position or to conceal their trail. I followed Miss Clay that afternoon as Holmes had requested. She left the Bluebell Inn just before tea, her pace quick despite the slick of dew still clinging to the lanes. I maintained a respectable distance, feigning interest in my pocketbook whenever she paused. She made her way toward the rectory, her movements tense and hesitant, pausing once as though to reconsider before ascending the front steps and knocking. It was Reverend Trullo who opened the door. They exchanged no words, at least none I could hear. She entered quickly, and the door shut behind her. I remained across the street, taking shelter under the edge of a yew hedge. Some 10 minutes passed, then 15, when Miss Clay finally emerged. Her shoulders were squared, her face composed but drained. She returned to the inn by a longer route, glancing over her shoulder once, though whether she sensed my presence I could not say. Holmes was waiting in our room, his expression unreadable as I recounted what I had seen. He nodded only once. "They are indeed allied," he said softly, "though not, I think, in guilt. She fears him, Watson, believes he knows something that might implicate her." "You believe she's innocent?" "I believe she is not the architect of this affair, but her involvement is undeniable. I intend to test her again." He said nothing more for the rest of the evening. I left him hunched in the lamplight, scribbling notes and diagrams while the wind scratched faintly at the panes. It was just past dawn when the second incident occurred. The inn stable boy came pounding at our door, face pale with fright and hair matted with sweat. "Sir," he gasped, there's smoke at the vicarage. The Reverend's study. It's alight, Holmes. and I were up in an instant, pulling on boots and coats. By the time we reached the rectory, a handful of villagers and Mr. Renfield had already formed a chain, passing buckets from the well. The fire, though fierce, seemed contained to a single room, Trullo's study. Holmes crouched at the threshold, watching the blaze with narrowed eyes. He did not join the line nor shout for aid. Instead, he pointed to the back of the house and drew me aside. "Too quick," he said under his breath. "Too specific. Someone has targeted this room, and only this room." "Trullo himself?" I asked. "We shall see." When the fire was doused and the air thick with scorched wood and ash, Trullo stood among the crowd, coughing but unharmed. His face, however, bore more than smoke. It carried a look of grave unease. Holmes approached him calmly. "Is anything missing?" he asked. Trullo hesitated. "My strong-box. It contained old documents, sermons, parish records. Only that?" "Yes." Holmes tilted his head. "Did Miss Hartwood ever access those documents?" Trullo's lips pressed into a line. "Once she asked about family histories. I directed her to the General Archives." "And last night, did you speak with Miss Clay?" He blinked. "Briefly. She was troubled. I offered spiritual counsel." Holmes's gaze hardened. "You offered her concealment. I wonder, Reverend, whether you believe that concealment will shield you when the truth emerges." Trullo stiffened. "I've done nothing unlawful." "But perhaps something unwise," Holmes murmured. "Something that now places you squarely in a fire's path." Back at the Bluebell Inn, the atmosphere had changed. The guests once merely curious, were now anxious. Mrs. Cranley refused to leave her room. Renfield kept to himself, his eyes twitching with nervous calculation. Even Osric Dane, whose wound had improved, seemed reluctant to speak. Holmes, however, was galvanized. "We are nearing the point of crisis, Watson. The fire was not an attempt to kill. It was an attempt to erase. And that tells me two things. First, that the culprit fears what the documents might reveal. Second, that they have not yet succeeded in silencing Miss Hartwood for good. Then she may still be alive? I believe so, but not for long, unless we force the hand that hides her." He paced the room, the attempt on Dane, the fire at the rectory. These are frantic actions, not measured ones. The culprit is growing desperate, and desperation leads to mistakes. He paused. "I shall leave something for them to find tonight. A false trail. If they follow it, I'll know where their loyalties lie." I leaned forward. "And what will we do when they take the bait?" Holmes smiled faintly, a glint of steel in his eyes. "We follow them into the shadows, Watson, and we do not blink." Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. The village of Farley Holt seemed to hold its breath. After the fire at the vicarage and the attack on Osric Dane, the inn's creaking staircases and hollow corridors took on a quality I had only previously experienced in battle. A silence loaded with anticipation, as though something in the dark corners of the world had begun to move. Holmes spent the better part of the morning closeted in our room, scrawling notes and crafting what he called the necessary illusion. It was not until late afternoon that he summoned me, his eyes bright and sharp, a sign I had long come to associate with his most calculated mischief. "I have composed a message," he said, handing me a folded slip of paper. "You will deliver it yourself. Place it where Renfield will discover it." I opened the note. It was brief and curious. Heartwood alive. Letter not in vicarage. Evidence placed in hollow stone behind the churchyard wall. Midnight. Tell no one. You intend him to act on this? I intend him to run straight to whoever is pulling the strings, Holmes replied. Renfield is not the mastermind, but he is the messenger. His type always is, passive, forgettable, and ideal for such errands. I made no argument. The logic was impeccable. That evening, under the pretence of fetching a pipe I'd left in the church vestry, I slipped the note into Renfield's coat pocket, which hung unattended in the entranceway. Holmes and I then waited, concealed across the lane beneath the thick hedge near the eastward path. The wind had risen, rustling the trees and brushing the fog from the ground like dust from an old stage. It was nearly 10:30 when the door of the inn opened, and Renfield emerged. He paused to glance about, then walked briskly toward the churchyard, clutching a lantern. We followed in silence, keeping to the shadows. Renfield did not go towards the vestry, or even the stone wall named in the letter. Instead, he circled around, to the rear of the church, following a path that led through a small copse of firs. Holmes's eyes glinted in the dark. "He's not going to retrieve the evidence," he murmured. "He's going to report." Indeed, the glimmer of another lantern now flickered ahead. A figure stood waiting at the forest's edge, draped in a heavy cloak. Renfield reached them and spoke in hurried, anxious tones. The second figure said nothing, but turned abruptly, gesturing for Renfield to follow. They disappeared behind the trees. Holmes tapped my arm. "We give them space, then follow." The path behind the firs twisted downward into a ravine lined with brambles and tall reeds. A narrow footbridge crossed a blackened stream, rotten with moss and nearly silent. On the far side stood an old tool shed, weather-worn and half-collapsed. Mikudavrancher, figures had gone inside. Holmes crept forward, using the slope to mask our advance. We reached a vantage point above the shed where, through a gap in the boards, we saw them dimly illuminated by the flickering lantern light. The cloaked figure removed. Their hood, it was Reverend Trullo. My breath caught in my throat, but Holmes remained perfectly still, watching, eyes narrowed. "I told you to wait!" Trullo hissed. "She said she had the letter," Renfield stammered. "She said she found it." "Lies!" Trullo snapped. "She's testing us. She wants to see what we'll do. She's working with Holmes." "But what about the girl?" "Safe, for now. But if she speaks..." The wind gusted, and we lost a few words. "She's still in the district?" Renfield asked. "Near enough," Trullo muttered. "I had to move her after the Dane business. She's drugged, secluded." My hand clenched at my side. Trullo turned suddenly toward the door. Holmes pulled me down behind the ridge. A moment passed, then a heavy sigh. "We wait one more day. If Holmes doesn't move, we leave tomorrow. But if he's already on to us, what about Miss Clay?" "She knows nothing, only what I've told her. She suspects, but has no proof." Holmes touched my shoulder, and we withdrew, making our way back through the trees as silently as we had come. Back in our room at the Bluebell Inn, Holmes sat in the low firelight, his expression grave, "He is not acting alone," he said at last, "but he is the key." "I never would have suspected the vicar," I said quietly, "because he wears the mask of piety, an ideal cover. But notice the pattern, Watson. Dane had a letter that mentioned the name Hartwood. Burned. The vicar's strongbox. Destroyed. And now this shed in the ravine. I believe Miss Hartwood is being held nearby." "And why?" "That," Holmes said, standing, "is the final veil we must tear aside, but now we act." He took up his coat and revolver. "Tonight we retrieve Miss Hartwood, or confirm her fate. I will not wait for Trullo to grow more desperate." It was near midnight when we returned to the ravine. Holmes led with purposeful strides, weaving through the fog like a man following a scent. We skirted the tool shed, then descended a narrow trail behind it, shielded by fallen stone walls and tangled underbrush. At the bottom of the hollow stood an old storage cellar, its roof sunken, its hinges rusted. Holmes examined the ground with his lantern. The soil bore recent prints. He nodded once. With a swift motion he drew a crowbar from beneath his coat and wedged it into the door. "Ready, Watson." I raised my revolver. "Always." The door groaned open, and within, slumped upon a mattress in the shadowed corner, pale and unconscious, was Beatrice Hartwood. Chapter 11. The Beatties. Laid Beatrice Hartwood's pale form lay motionless as Holmes, and I stepped into the cold cellar. The air was damp and bitter with mildew, and the only light came from Holmes's lantern, which cast long shadows across the cracked walls. Her face, though drawn, showed no signs of injury. She was breathing, but shallowly. "She's been sedated," Holmes murmured as he crouched beside her, inspecting her pulse with practised precision. "Laudanum, or a related derivative, just enough to keep her quiet." I knelt at her other side, gently lifting her wrist. Her skin was icy to the touch. "Good Lord," I said, "to have hidden her here, just a few hundred yards from the inn all along." Holmes glanced about the chamber. It was cunning, the perfect inversion of logic. Hide what you wish never to be found in plain reach, where no one would think to look. He rose. "But now we have a dilemma, Watson." "How so?" "If we remove her tonight, the perpetrators will vanish. Trullo and whoever else he shields will simply flee. We'll have saved Miss Hartwood, but lost the thread that binds the entire affair together." I frowned. Surely her testimony would be enough. Holmes shook his head. "Perhaps enough to implicate Trullo, yes, but there is more at work here than one reverend's misguided ambition. I suspect blackmail, possibly even inheritance fraud. Miss Hartwood knows something, but until she recovers fully, we cannot risk alerting our quarry." I stared at him, understanding dawning. "You mean to leave her here?" "For a matter of hours only. I shall return before dawn and extract her myself once the net is in place. And in the meantime—" Holmes's eyes glittered with resolve. "We bait the trap." By the time we returned to the Bluebell Inn, the village was quiet. A heavy mist had rolled in from the north, settling like a woolen shroud over the cobblestones and hedgerows. Holmes asked for a candle and ink from Mrs. Royston, and disappeared into our room, where he drafted a message on thick parchment. I stood by the window, watching the quiet silhouette of the church steeple against the clouded moon. At last, Holmes sealed the note with wax and handed it to me. "You are to deliver this to Reverend Trullo at first light," he instructed. "Do not speak a word. Simply hand it to him and walk away." I unfolded the message to read, "We have the girl. She spoke before she slept. I shall inform Scotland Yard at noon unless you come clean. If there is anything you wish to confess, you may do so at the Bluebell Inn before 11 o'clock. No tricks, Reverend. You have one chance." "No signature?" I asked. "None needed," Holmes said. "He will know precisely who wrote it." At breakfast the next morning, the tension in the inn was as taut as a bowstring. Renfield was conspicuously absent. Miss Clay had taken her meal in her room. Dane, swaddled in blankets, sat stiffly near the hearth, his one good eye watching the door with nervous intensity. I spotted Trullo entering from the lane just after 10. He looked pale but composed, his clerical collar tight against his throat. Holmes rose at once and gestured to the empty parlour. "Come, Reverend, let us speak plainly." Trullo followed with no resistance, though his eyes flicked once to me as I passed behind him. There was guilt there, but not the cold, cunning guilt of a murderer, more the look of a man trapped within a scheme that had spiralled beyond his grasp. Holmes shut the parlour door and turned without ceremony. "Beatrice Hartwood is alive." Trullo sagged, the lie gone from him like air from a pricked balloon. I didn't hurt her." "You concealed her," Holmes said, "which is quite serious enough. She was in your care, a guest, a relative. And when she discovered something that jeopardized your position, you chose silence over decency." Trullo slumped into a chair, his hands trembling. "She came to me a week before her disappearance," he said, voice barely audible. "She had found an old letter among the parish records, one written by her grandfather, it seems. It suggested that her late father's will had been falsified after his death, that her uncle, Mr. Dane, was not the rightful heir to the Hartwood estate." Holmes raised a brow. "Intriguing. And the signature?" "She believed it had been copied. She brought the letter to me, asking what to do. And you?" Trullo looked up, eyes red-rimmed. I panicked. Dane was a powerful man. He has friends in legal circles. If it was true, it would have destroyed him. He came to me that very evening. I don't know how he found out. Perhaps he saw her reading in the parish library. He begged me to intervene." "So you concealed her?" Holmes said coldly. "I told her I needed time to investigate the claim, that it might be best if she withdrew from sight until it could be verified. I offered the old storage cellar, said it would only be for a day or two." He swallowed. "But then she vanished." "Not vanished, Reverend," Holmes corrected. "You moved her, or someone did. Who helped you?" Trullo hesitated. "Renfield knew. I needed someone to fetch food, water, bedding. He agreed. But then things escalated. The fire, the attack on Dane. I've been afraid." Holmes leaned in. "You are no longer in control. Renfield is not the end of it. Someone else gave the order to silence Miss Hartwood. Either Dane, fearing exposure, or another, seeking to manipulate them both." Trullo looked up. "Then you believe me? I never meant to harm her." "That," Holmes said, rising, "remains to be seen. You will remain at the inn until further notice. If you attempt to flee, I shall have you arrested within the hour." As Trullo left the room, I turned to Holmes. "What now?" "Now," he said. "We follow Renfield. He is the weak link, and he has just realized his master has abandoned him." I moved to the window, scanning the street. "There," I said, pointing. "He's heading south, toward the woods." Holmes grabbed his coat. "Come, Watson. If Renfield is going to make a deal to save himself, I intend to listen in." Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. The day had dulled under an overcast sky as Holmes and I followed Renfield through the hedgerow-laced outskirts of Farley Holt. A fine drizzle had begun to fall, softening the path and muffling our steps as we trailed the man at a cautious distance. Renfield walked swiftly, hunched into his coat, darting glances behind him every few yards. He kept to narrow footpaths and bridleways, eventually veering toward a stretch of woodland behind the vicarage. Holmes motioned for us to keep low behind a stand of holly trees. "He's frightened," Holmes murmured, "and desperate. That combination will lead him to the only person he believes can protect him." "Which is Dane?" I asked. Holmes frowned. "Not necessarily. Dane is compromised, perhaps dying. Renfield may now look to whomever truly orchestrated this deception, someone still holding the reins." We reached a small rise that overlooked a clearing, part of an old, disused sheepfold. At the centre stood a weathered gazebo of sorts, half collapsed, under ivy and neglect. Renfield approached it with visible reluctance. To our astonishment, a woman stepped from behind the structure, Miss Lillian Clay. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "She," he whispered, "is far more than she claimed to be." "I had no choice," Renfield cried. "Trullo has lost his nerve. Holmes found the girl. He'll turn us all over to the yard." Miss Clay did not flinch. Her arms were folded, her posture commanding. "You panicked, Albert," she said coldly. "You were meant to watch, and—" "Wait, there's no more time," Renfield stammered. "That detective, he's closing in. You said you had a plan? Well, now's the time." Holmes touched my arm and we crouched lower, allowing the mist and bramble to shield our position. "Miss Clay's voice turned low and sharp. What precisely did Holmes find? Has she spoken?" "No, she was asleep. Drugged. But they'll wake her. Maybe they already have." Miss Clay considered this, then spoke again with calculated calm. "Then you will go to Trullo. Tell him the girl is safe, that she was never in danger. Holmes must be misled until we can retrieve the letter." Renfield blinked. "But you burned it in the vicarage fire." A pause. "No, Albert, I never burned it." Holmes inhaled sharply. "She lied to Dane," he whispered. "The letter still exists. She has kept it, possibly for leverage. Blackmail, or worse." Miss Clay was speaking again. "Holmes must believe he has won, at least for now. Tomorrow morning I'll take the carriage to Lichfield under the pretence of informing the girl's relatives. You'll accompany me. In truth, we'll travel to the solicitor's office in Alchester and present the new will." Renfield blinked again, confused. "You forged another?" "No. I found the original, hidden among the vicar's archives, before Dane ever knew. It names Beatrice sole heiress. Once she is discredited, declared unstable or missing, the estate will pass to her next of kin." "And who is that, Albert?" He stared blankly. "Me," said Miss Clay, smiling faintly. "By marriage." My breath caught. Then she's not the girl's companion, I whispered. She's her cousin. Or half-sister, Holmes replied. Or even a secret wife of the elder Hartwood's illegitimate son. No wonder she inserted herself into the girl's trust. Down below, Renfield hesitated. And if Holmes stops you? Miss Clay turned, eyes flashing. Then I will stop him first. She vanished behind the vines. We returned to the Bluebell Inn before dusk. Holmes said little until we reached the privacy of our room. Then he sat by the hearth, removed his gloves, and steepled his fingers. The mystery is at last complete. Watson, every actor has revealed their part. I took a seat opposite him. You believe Miss Clay intended all this from the beginning? She's the architect of it all, Holmes said. Trullo was a pawn, chosen for his weakness and conscience. Dane, a brutish obstacle. Renfield, a mule. But Miss Clay, she was the one who sought the Hartwood inheritance from the first, embedding herself beside Beatrice under the guise of service and friendship. But how did she learn about the letter? Simple, Holmes replied. She was present when Beatrice discovered it. Or perhaps she suspected all along. Remember, she told us she came into Beatrice's employ just 3 months ago, shortly after Dane acquired the manor. That timing is no coincidence. I nodded slowly. And the letter, if it's genuine. It proves Dane inherited by fraud, Holmes said, and that Beatrice is the rightful heir. He stood, pacing the room. Now that we know the shape of the scheme, we must cut it off before its final stroke. Miss Clay intends to discredit Beatrice and abscond with the document. She must not be allowed to leave Farley Holt. You'll stop her? Tomorrow, Holmes said, but not alone. Tonight I shall write to Inspector Gregson in Alchester, and have a man stationed along every road out of the village. And what of Beatrice? I asked. She must remain safe and unaware. If she learns too soon, she may act rashly or confront Clay directly. No, she is to stay under watch, in the care of Mrs. Royston, whom I now trust more than any other. Looked at him. You're certain this is the whole story? Holmes's expression shifted, just slightly. Not quite. There is still one puzzle that troubles me. What's that? He turned to the fire, his eyes distant. The message. The original note that summoned Beatrice to the woods on the night she vanished. Who wrote it? It was not Dane, nor Trullo, nor Clay, and Beatrice swore she recognized the handwriting. He was silent for a moment. Then he looked at me with sudden clarity. And now, Watson, now I believe I know who it was. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. The village of Farley Holt was cloaked in a low fog the next morning, the sun a pale disk barely visible through the gauzy mist. Holmes had slept but an hour, spending most of the night at the writing desk, drafting messages to Inspector Gregson and the local constable, Mr. Fenwick, whose cooperation Holmes had finally secured through a well-placed telegram from Scotland Yard. By dawn, 3 discreet riders had departed, one to intercept Clay's intended journey, another to Alchester to verify the will at the solicitor's office, and the third to ensure that the solicitor himself, Mr. Halberd, remained available for questioning. Holmes left nothing to chance. "Today," he said as we took a hurried breakfast, "we cut the string on Miss Clay's delicate marionette show. And if she attempts to flee, I asked. She will, Holmes replied. The revelation in the woods spooked her. She knows her conspiracy is close to collapse. The question is not if she'll run, but when and how. At precisely 10 o'clock, the village square came to life. A hired landau carriage arrived at the front of the Bluebell Inn, its driver a wiry man with a tobacco-stained beard. Miss Clay descended the steps moments later, her attire immaculate, her demeanour perfectly composed. "Are you sure she's not simply attending to legal business?" I whispered from behind the bakery's side alcove, where Holmes and I crouched. "Peut-être?" "She has no appointment," Holmes said, "and she carries not a letter or affidavit, but a single leather valise. Too small for legal documents, too large to be empty." Renfield followed close behind her, shoulders hunched, eyes scanning the street. His nerves had clearly begun to unravel. As Miss Clay prepared to step into the carriage, a sudden voice rang out. "Miss Clay!" She turned. Trullo was approaching from the direction of the vicarage, holding a folded paper in his hand. "I must speak with you, privately," he said, breathless. "It's urgent." She gave a tight smile. "Whatever it is, Reverend, it will have to wait. I'm en route to Lichfield to inform Beatrice's cousin of her recovery." Holmes emerged then, calm as ever. "I should very much like to see that document, Reverend." Clay stiffened. "Mr. Holmes, I wasn't aware you'd taken to ambushing gentlewomen on village errands." "Nor was I aware that gentlewomen conspired to defraud heirs, forge documents, and orchestrate kidnappings under the pretence of charity," Holmes said coldly. Her composure cracked for the first time. "You have no proof." Holmes stepped forward. "No? Then allow me to name the items in your valise. The original Hartwood letter, unsigned but authentic, the draft of a forged testament bearing Beatrice's signature, and several notes from Reverend Trullo, coerced by your influence, implicating him in Beatrice's retreat. That valise, Miss Clay, is a damning catalogue of your misdeeds." She glanced at Renfield, whose face had gone ashen. "You fool!" she whispered, and then she turned on her heel and ran. I will never forget what happened next. Miss Clay sprinted not down the main road, but toward the back lane, leading behind, the stable, weaving through villagers startled by her sudden flight. Holmes took off after her, coat flaring, and I followed, heart pounding. She dashed into the rear pasture, past the hedgerow, and into the woods. The same woods where Beatrice had been hidden and where her deception had begun. Holmes was fast, but Miss Clay was agile. She ducked under branches, tore through brambles, and finally emerged at the river's edge, where the narrow footbridge crossed toward the northern ridge. Holmes called out, "There's nowhere to go, Miss Clay." She turned, her expression one of fury and desperation. "You think you've beaten me? You don't even understand it, Holmes. Then help me understand. Why go so far? Why hurt the girl? Someone who knew when I took my tea." Toller, I felt a chill that was not from the window draught. Holmes seemed to read my thought and shook his head. "No, Toller's reactions have been too raw. If he were acting, he would have slipped by now. But someone else." He turned sharply and strode from the room. Downstairs, the common room was empty save for the crackling hearth. Greeley, the solicitor, sat in his usual armchair, reading a leather-bound volume. He looked up at our approach. Holmes did not speak. He simply moved to the hearth and knelt, inspecting the ashes. Then he reached into the iron grate and withdrew a long-handled poker. He examined it silently, then looked back at Greeley. "You visited Addleton," Holmes said calmly. Greeley blinked. "I've told you. You also visited St. Emmeren's Chapel before us. You knew Marjorie had gone there, and you hoped to intercept what she left behind. That's why your coat bore stone dust. But more than that." He lifted the poker. This was recently scrubbed, not to clean soot, but to remove blood. Greeley set his book down, his face hardening. "I warn you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes stepped closer. "You drugged her. You brought her down to the cellar, handed her over to the impostor. You assumed it would be quick. But it wasn't, was it? She struggled. She left behind marks you couldn't erase." Greeley's hand twitched. "Scotland Yard is on their way," Holmes added. "Your last chance at mercy lies in truth." "I did what I was told," Greeley said at last. His voice had dropped into something bitter, hoarse. "I was chosen. I wasn't supposed to ask questions, but she kept digging. She threatened to ruin everything. Do you know what it cost me to keep that silence?" "You didn't keep it," Holmes said coldly. "You tried to erase it." Greeley stood, knocking over the chair. "It's not me you should fear, Holmes. You think you've solved it? You haven't even begun." From within his coat he drew a small vial. "Ether again," Holmes muttered. But this time Greeley wasn't aiming to drug. He hurled the vial at the fire. The flames roared upward in a sudden plume of heat and smoke. "Watson, get Marjorie!" Holmes shouted. I ran as the smoke surged up the stairs. Behind me, I heard the clatter of a struggle. Holmes grappling with Greeley. I turned at the landing and saw the solicitor twist free and dash toward the back exit, smoke trailing him like a cloak. Marjorie was already rising when I reached her. "Come, quickly!" We wrapped a blanket over her shoulders and made our way out, coughing, the hallway filling with dark grey haze. Tola met us on the stairs with a wet cloth pressed to his face. "Out the front! Constables are clearing the path." As we emerged into the courtyard, Holmes joined us. Soot smudged across his cheek, but otherwise unharmed. He fled through the rear, Rigby's giving chase. We watched the flames consume the far wall of the inn before the village brigade arrived. Water hissed and steam billowed. By then, the fire had revealed more than just Greeley's treachery. In the cellar, hidden beneath the boards where the ritual chair had stood, was a sealed trapdoor. It led not to another room, but to a narrow tunnel, now choked with ash. "A second exit," Holmes said, crouching over it. That's how she was moved. Not through the front, through the hidden path. "And if Greeley used it once," I added, "others may still be watching it." Holmes turned to the constable beside him. "Double the guard on Miss Hartwood, and post men at the edge of Briar's Edge. We're no longer waiting for them to come to us." "But what if they already have?" I asked. Holmes said nothing. Instead, he stared into the dying fire, where the mask, set on the mantel before, the blaze had blackened but not burned. Its hollow eyes, cracked but intact, reflected the flickering embers. The final move we knew had begun. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed. The fire at the Bluebell Inn had been controlled, but its scars lingered. One wall of the common room was scorched to blackened timber, and smoke had stained the upper corridor ceilings like smudged charcoal drawings. Marjorie was moved to the vicarage under armed guard, and Constable Rigby redoubled patrols through the village lanes. But the man we wanted, Greeley, had vanished once again. "He's not running," Holmes said the following morning, eyes fixed on the charred remains of the poker he now held with a handkerchief. "He's circling." We stood in the remains of the common room, our boots crunching over damp ash. The dawn light filtered through broken shutters, casting long grey shadows across the walls. "Circling?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "He believes he is still useful to Lorne. Disposable, yes, but not yet discarded, which means he'll attempt contact. But Lorne, I suspect, is already prepared to sacrifice him." He knelt beside the hearth, where the fire had burned hottest. With gloved fingers, he pulled aside the remains of the mantle and retrieved something from the crumbled base. Half-melted wax, fused with fragments of parchment. He held it up to the light. "A seal," he murmured. "Broken, but familiar." I leaned in. "The crest. Yes, but look at this." He gestured to the parchment edge, on which a fragment of handwriting remained. "Not Marjorie's. This ink is iron gall, and this hand is far older." He tucked it carefully into a leather folder and stood. "They burned something here, something they could not risk being found." "You believe Greeley came here to retrieve it?" "No. He came to destroy it, under orders." He stared into the soot as if it were a map. "The final clue," murmured, "is not where they left her. It's where they sent their others." I frowned. "You mean the vanished patients? The ones Marjorie referenced in the ledger?" He nodded. "Altham and others. Each recorded, each erased. The Brotherhood called it cleansing, but they needed a place to put what was left." He returned to the table and spread the map Lyon had given us. Beside it, he placed the crumbling remains of the wax seal. I thought the hollow of Briar's Edge was their deepest refuge. It isn't. He pointed to a second mark, one we had glossed over days earlier, a circle deep in the woods further south than the hollow. "The chalice," I said. "Lyon mentioned it." "Yes. And look, these trails around it are not roads. They're waterways." "A reservoir?" "A quarry," Holmes corrected. "Once mined for chalk, now flooded. Ideal for concealment." I felt the chill return. "You believe they're there? And I believe their final rites, whatever remained of them, were performed there. Cleansing by fire, cleansing by ether, and I suspect cleansing by water." "And Marjorie?" "She was to be taken there. But Greeley failed. Now, they must act quickly. They'll abandon the site soon, burn it, collapse it, or worse. And if Lorne is there—" He did not finish the sentence. Instead, he snapped the folder shut and began gathering supplies. An hour later, we rode out from Elcombe with a small party. Holmes, myself, Constable Rigby, and 2 local watchmen. We followed the stream beyond, Briar's Edge, through the bramble-choked trails, and into the lower woods, where the land sagged into a shallow basin. The quarry appeared through the trees like a black mirror, still, silent, its edges framed by the skeletons of half-felled trees and crumbling stone. The water was dark, not from depth, but from something thicker that clung to its surface. Oil, perhaps, or the residue of something burned. Holmes dismounted and crouched near the edge. "Recently disturbed," he said, running his fingers along the moss-covered stones. "Boot prints, at least 3 men, one dragging something." A faint path wound along the southern edge of the quarry, where an old mining shed sagged beneath the weight of its rotting roof. We approached slowly, rifles raised. Inside was silence until Holmes touched the door. It creaked open to reveal a single chair, facing a table, and on the table the mask, but not the same one. This one was newer, clean, its wood unstained, but the eyes, always the eyes, had been carved in the same familiar ovals. And this time, below the mark of the broken tree, a name had been etched, Lorne. Holmes stepped inside. "He left this for us," he said. "An invitation, or a warning." Beneath the mask was a letter, folded, sealed in wax. Holmes opened it, read it silently, then handed it to me. "Mr. Holmes, you have proven yourself a man of rare persistence. It would be wrong of me not to acknowledge that. But you are chasing shadows that were already vanishing when I first donned the mask. We are not a cult, nor a brotherhood. We are something far more dangerous. A habit, a memory. You may unmask one of us, even bury a few. But you cannot kill what lingers in doctrine and blood. Let her go. Let the past rot, or follow it and join it." Lorne Rigby exhaled. "He's taunting us." "No," Holmes said. "He's preparing to vanish. Again. This is the end game." I looked at the water. "If he's here, we need to search the quarry." Holmes turned, eyes steeled. "We will, but not blindly. He expects pursuit. So we give him silence. We'll watch. We'll wait. Tonight, we let him believe the mask holds the final word." He picked it up, studied it one last time, then placed it inside the satchel. As we turned to leave, Holmes paused once more to survey the black water. He said, "A memory cannot be killed," he murmured. Then he looked to me. "But a man can, and he will be found." The final clue at last had a face, and the hunt for the man behind the mask was nearly at its end. Chapter 15. The final gathering that evening back at the Bluebell Inn. Now quiet, but no longer quite so whole, Holmes gathered all remaining parties in the drawing-room, as though preparing for a performance. The curtains had been drawn tight, the soot-stained hearth scrubbed, and a new lantern placed on the mantel in place of the one consumed in the fire. The smell of damp wood still lingered, but there was something sharper in the air now. Anticipation. "She wasn't meant to be hurt," Clay shouted. "She was meant to disappear." Dane was too drunk with power to see the value of subtlety. I gave her the note to lure her out. Yes, but I only wanted her out of the way long enough to let the papers pass. She refused to sign. She refused everything. "And so you silenced her." "No," she spat. "Dane did. I told him to frighten her, to keep her hidden. He tried to kill her. That wasn't my doing." Behind us, I heard Fenwick and 2 local men arrive, having been signalled by Holmes's earlier message. Clay saw them too. "I will not be humiliated," she said, and made a final frantic dash, this time towards the narrow bridge. She never reached the far side. As she stepped onto the slick wooden planks, her heel caught. The valise slipped from her hand and tumbled into the rushing stream. She reached to catch it, lost her balance, and plunged into the icy water with a scream. Fenwick waded in after her, and after a struggle managed to pull her out, soaked, shivering and defeated. Holmes retrieved the valise from where it had washed ashore, dripping but intact. Back at the Bluebell Inn, Miss Clay sat by the fire under heavy guard, wrapped in blankets, her expression hollow. The documents were examined and confirmed, and Trullo, though still racked with guilt, signed a statement verifying the chain of events. Renfield, broken by the chase, confessed to his involvement in the concealment of Beatrice, and Mr. Dane, now conscious but weak, was notified that charges would be filed against him as soon as he was well enough to face them. Holmes placed the Heartwood letter on the inn's table and turned to me. "That," he said, "was the last of the questions answered. Except one," I replied. "Oh? You mentioned that Beatrice recognized the handwriting on the note summoning her into the woods. You said it wasn't Dane, Clay, or Trullo." Holmes nodded. "Then whose was it?" He picked up the letter and held it to the firelight. "Ditiote was her own." I stared. Her own? She wrote it days earlier as a reminder to herself, planning to meet a solicitor in secret. Clay found it in her room and used it, rewriting the body of the message, but preserving Beatrice's own script in the address and salutation. That's why she trusted it. He handed me the letter. Manipulation, Watson, not of events alone, but of identity, trust, and truth itself. That is the truest mark of criminal genius. I looked at him. And yet you outplayed her. Holmes smiled faintly. Elementary, my dear Watson. She played a clever game, but she underestimated one thing. What's that? She thought only she understood the value of misdirection. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue. Revealed by the following morning, the sun had broken fully through the mist over Farley Holt, warming the shingles of the Bluebell Inn and softening the edges of the previous day's frenzied events. But the quiet was deceptive. Holmes had not yet declared the case solved, not fully, while Miss Clay remained under guard, and the documents in the valise had damned her quite thoroughly. A particular tightness remained in Holmes's expression. He paced the sitting room, like a man still sniffing out the lingering traces of a half-glimpsed scent. "It is nearly complete," he said, tapping the window-sill with a restless finger, "but not yet whole." I was about to inquire what further element he sought when a sharp knock came at the door. It was Mr. Fenwick, hat in hand, his brow knitted. "A telegram just arrived for you, Mr. Holmes, from Alchester." Holmes took it with a quick nod, tore the envelope and scanned the contents. His face, always so deliberate in expression, shifted, almost imperceptibly. "Watson," he murmured, "we have it." I stepped forward. "Have what?" He held out the telegram. It read, "Halbert confirms no supplemental will register. Miss Heartwood, legal beneficiary to estate. Says Clay, never had authority nor letters. Stop. All documents held for review." Gregson Holmes folded the paper with a satisfied snap. "So, the motive is settled," he said. "Clay had no inheritance, no guardianship, no legitimacy of any kind. She was forging a new order with herself at the helm. But even so, that cannot explain the vicar." "You mean Trullo's complicity?" I asked. "He said he was coerced." Holmes gave a faint smile. "He said so, yes. But men of the cloth, are not easily coerced, and even under coercion they rarely lie so deftly. He turned back to the hearth, where the remnants of last night's fire still smouldered faintly. "It was not for money that Trullo aided Clay," he said. "It was for something else, something older, perhaps." He reached for the small wooden box we had retrieved from Miss Clay's valise. Inside was a folded letter marked "Private" in faded script. "I did not open this last night, as it bore Miss Hartwood's seal," Holmes said, "but now that the contents of the case are in full judicial review, we must risk it." He unfolded the letter carefully. As he read, I watched his expression shift from intrigue to grim confirmation. "Well?" I said at last. Holmes laid the letter flat. "It is from Beatrice's mother. A letter she wrote shortly before her death, but never posted. It was found among her things after the funeral. Miss Clay had obtained it during her time caring for Beatrice. What does it say?" Holmes pointed to a passage mid-page. "There is more than sorrow I carry in my heart, my darling Beatrice. There is also the shadow of betrayal. Reverend Trullo, whom all the village trusts, once wronged me in ways I could never publicly voice. You must be careful with him. There was a time, long ago, when he sought to make you legally his ward through pressure and false piety. I refused him, but I fear in my absence he may find his way to you again." I felt the heat rise to my face. He intended to control her, perhaps even her inheritance. Holmes nodded. "Exactly. When Clay approached him with a plot that would keep Beatrice out of the picture, perhaps even in an asylum, with her faculties doubted, he saw opportunity. He agreed. She handled the forgeries. He provided the cover. Renfield was merely the courier. And Dane? A blunt instrument. Miss Clay tried to use him to frighten the girl. He overstepped, perhaps drunk, perhaps out of his depth. Trullo covered it up and moved her to the cellar to keep her out of reach." Holmes turned and looked out the window. "But what's most telling," he added, "is what Clay didn't know. She didn't know of this letter's existence. She had stolen it for its seal, not its contents. She thought it was merely something private. But Trullo must have read it. And still, he acted." There was a silence between us. "I believe," Holmes said, "that when the trial comes, Trullo will confess only to being misled. But in truth, he was far more invested. The spectre of control over Beatrice was not born from recent events. It is a compulsion that dates back to her infancy. That afternoon, Holmes requested that all relevant parties, Fenwick, the village solicitor, Miss Hartwood, Renfield, and Trullo, be gathered in the drawing-room of the Bluebell Inn. The vicar, pale and trembling, entered last, his hat clutched in nervous fingers. Holmes stood before them with the same calm he exhibited in every parlour, every courtroom, every sitting-room where a truth was waiting to be peeled away. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I believe the time has come to remove all remaining veils. What began as a simple disappearance has now unravelled into a calculated plot, layered in fraud, secrecy, and manipulation." He turned to Trullo. "You, Reverend, were not merely an unwilling accomplice. You were a quiet architect. You concealed Miss Hartwood not to protect her, but to bury her, to remove her from the line of inheritance. You convinced yourself that it was a necessary evil, that it was Clay's plan, but in truth you saw in her silence The opportunity for power. Trullo's face crumpled. "I never meant to harm her," he murmured. "You meant to erase her," Holmes replied coldly. "But your method was less physical than legal. Clay was to do the penwork. You would ensure the silence." Miss Hartwood spoke then softly but clearly. "Why?" she asked. "You baptized me." Trullo could not meet her gaze. "You were never meant to be lost," Holmes said gently. "But you were very nearly taken." He stepped back then, letting the silence settle, a silence that spoke not just of guilt, but of release. Outside, the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows over the inn. Watson leaned toward me. "It's over now, surely," Holmes, without looking up, said. "Now, yes, the final key was motive, not greed, but obsession." He turned to Miss Hartwood. "Now that truth has light, Miss Hartwood, you may begin again. This time, without those who would trade guardianship, aunt for control." And with that, he stepped away, leaving the fire to crackle and justice to settle over Farley Holt, like the first true night of peace. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The drawing-room of the Bluebell Inn had, by evening, taken on the air of a courtroom. The thick curtains had been drawn, casting the chamber in lamplight's amber glow. Rain pattered softly against the windows, as if the skies themselves wished to bear witness. Holmes had sent formal invitations to each principal figure in the affair, requesting their presence under the guise of clarification, though the truth was far more theatrical. I took my seat beside the hearth, notebook in hand. Holmes stood near the centre of the room, silent and still, his eyes surveying the guests as they filed in one by one. First came Mr. Fenwick, the innkeeper, his face drawn with fatigue and curiosity. He bowed briefly to Holmes and sat stiffly, near the window. Then Miss Beatrice Hartwood entered, her posture upright, though a faint tremble still clung to her fingertips. She gave me a wan smile as I rose to greet her. "I'm told we are to learn the whole of it this evening," she murmured. "I suspect we are," I said. "Holmes rarely assembles a room without purpose." Mrs. Cranley followed, wringing a handkerchief between her gloved fingers. Her once imperious bearing was now replaced with nervous silence. She refused to meet Miss Hartwood's gaze, and sat near the edge of the chaise, where shadows pooled. Osric Dane arrived next, still bandaged, but upright and guarded. He leaned heavily on a cane, and muttered something inaudible to Holmes before, sinking into an armchair with a wince. Renfield slunk in after him, his moustache twitching. His eyes flicked constantly from face to face, and he avoided the gaze of both Holmes and Miss Clay. Miss Clay herself was the last to arrive, escorted by a local constable, stationed discreetly in the hallway. Her appearance had altered little. Still elegant, still composed, but there was a tension around her eyes, a brittleness to her carriage. She offered Holmes the faintest smile as she crossed the room and seated herself with crossed ankles, like a woman at the theatre. And finally, Reverend Trullo entered, wearing his black frock coat and a look of sorrowful resignation. The vicar's eyes scanned the room, lingering longest on Miss Hartwood. He seemed smaller than before, as though the weight of his conscience had compressed his very frame. Holmes waited until the door closed, then stepped into the centre of the room and slowly turned to address them. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone steady, You have each played a part, some wittingly, others not, in the curious matter that began with the disappearance of Miss Beatrice Hartwood. From this very inn, no one spoke. Holmes continued. What appeared at first to be a baffling vanishing act proved to be the opening move in a game of inheritance, influence, and deeply buried grievances. Tonight I shall lay out every piece of that puzzle. And when I am done, there will be no doubt as to what transpired or who orchestrated it. I leaned forward, pen poised, watching as Holmes paced with deliberate calm. It began with an assumption that Miss Hartwood had vanished of her own accord, or perhaps suffered some mental disturbance. That narrative was not born from the facts, but from whispers, planted, I now believe, by Miss Clay and sanctioned by the Reverend Trullo. He turned sharply toward them both. You, Miss Clay, told others that Miss Hartwood had been suffering from episodes. But no physician ever recorded such findings. No such ailment was ever diagnosed. It was a lie designed to discredit her judgment. Clay raised a brow. And yet she disappeared. Because you made her disappear, Holmes said, the words quiet but cutting. You used Osric Dane to frighten her into flight. When she ran, you intercepted her, perhaps with the aid of Renfield, and confined her in the cellar of the rectory under the vicar's complicity. Renfield stammered. She asked to stay there. I swear, she needed rest. Holmes held up a hand. Enough. You played your part. The reasons do not lessen the facts. He turned now to Trullo, and you, Reverend, claimed to offer sanctuary. But your motives were far from pious. A letter from Miss Hartwood's mother revealed your earlier attempts to gain legal control of the girl's estate, attempts that failed during her mother's life and were revived once Beatrice became vulnerable. Trullo's shoulders slumped, but he said nothing. Holmes resumed, speaking to the room at large. Once she was silenced, the plan progressed. Miss Clay began forging letters, one of which named her as executor of Beatrice's affairs. She had already convinced others that Beatrice's mind was not sound, and thus the legal apparatus was set in motion. But then he paused, raising a finger. An unforeseen complication arose. A letter, one penned by Beatrice and posted in secret to a solicitor in London, expressing doubts about her treatment and fears for her safety. The solicitor forwarded it to Scotland Yard, and that is how the case arrived at Baker Street. The room was still. Even Dane had ceased fidgeting. Holmes drew a breath. The second act began with violence. Dane was assaulted not by an unknown figure, but likely by Renfield himself, either on Miss Clay's order, or in fear he would expose too much. The intention was misdirection, to suggest outside interference, a shadowy figure none of us had seen, a ghost in the night. He walked slowly past Miss Clay, who now sat entirely motionless. But when the fire broke out in the rectory, it became clear that desperation had replaced strategy. The study was targeted, its contents burned. Unfortunately for you, Miss Clay, I had already secured the most damning documents, forged letters, altered wills, and your travel correspondence with a London notary. Holmes turned back to the rest of the room. Everything after that was merely panic. And panic, as we know, is rarely silent. For a moment there was only the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Then Holmes stepped back and spoke quietly. I shall, of course, present all findings to the magistrate. Miss Hartwood's inheritance will be restored, and justice, I trust, will follow for those who sought to steal it." Clay, though visibly stricken, said only, "You're very clever, Mr. Holmes, but not all cleverness brings peace." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "No," he said, "but it brings truth." And with that, he signalled to the constable in the hallway. The door opened, and slowly, inevitably, justice entered. Chapter 16. Holmes breaks down the crime. The constable stepped forward, placing a firm but not unkind hand on Miss Clay's shoulder. A hush settled over the drawing-room. She did not resist. Indeed, she seemed almost relieved, as though the burden of pretense had grown too heavy to bear. Holmes waited until she had been quietly escorted from the room before he turned again to face the assembled guests. His gaze swept across them, from Mrs. Cranley's trembling form to the pinched features of Mr. Renfield, and finally to the Reverend Trullo, whose eyes remained fixed upon the hearth as if searching for redemption in its fading embers. "Now," Holmes said, "let us examine the puzzle in full, and see how each piece reveals the design." He moved toward the writing desk and retrieved a thin folder. From it he withdrew a series of notes and correspondences, laying them upon the table for all to see. "It began," he said, "with the assumption that Miss Hartwood's disappearance was voluntary or hysterical. But I ask you, what woman, in full command of her fortune, her intellect and her surroundings, vanishes from a locked room without a trace, leaving behind all possessions save a walking cloak?" Mrs. Cranley gave a soft gasp, which Holmes ignored. There was no sign of a struggle, yet no indication of a planned departure. The window, though open, bore no scuffs on the sill or soil beneath. The door had been locked from the inside, a mystery indeed, but not an impossible one. He tapped the papers. Miss Hartwood was taken, not by force, but by manipulation. Miss Clay, who had gradually undermined her confidence over several months, used the pretense of illness and concern to isolate her. The moment Dane's theatrical nighttime assault occurred, a diversion carefully staged, I believe, Miss Clay took advantage of Beatrice's terror and convinced her to seek refuge. That refuge, of course, was the rectory. Holmes nodded toward Trullo. "Reverend, you harboured her in secret. Whether from guilt, misguided protection, or darker motives, I cannot say. But you permitted a fiction to be built, one that gave Miss Clay time to prepare forged documents and legal arguments to challenge Beatrice's claim to her mother's inheritance." The vicar bowed his head, murmuring, "I believed I was protecting her." Holmes's voice was gentle but firm. "Perhaps you were, but concealment bred conspiracy, and the truth was buried beneath fire and fear." He turned next to Renfield, who shrank in his seat. "You played a subtler role, Mr. Renfield. You ferried letters, arranged carriages, perhaps supplied laudanum or tonics to keep Miss Hartwood subdued. You may not have known the entire plot, but you knew enough to profit, and to silence yourself." Renfield's moustache twitched. I did what I was told." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Indeed, that phrase echoes down the centuries, always in the mouths of men who refuse to think for themselves." He turned back to the rest of the room. "Miss Clay, you see, required a plausible route to claim authority. She produced a falsified letter, naming herself as Beatrice's guardian, citing the young woman's alleged instability. This she intended to present to a solicitor in London, Mr. Marston, I believe, whose services she had retained under false pretences. From his folder, Holmes withdrew a letter stamped with a solicitor's crest. Mr. Marston contacted me 2 days ago after receiving my telegram. He confirmed that Miss Clay had presented herself as Beatrice Hartwood's legal proxy, but her documents contained a fatal flaw. A date stamp indicating that the letter naming her executor had been typed before the supposed disappearance, not after. Holmes smiled faintly. She forged the document too soon. That was her undoing. Could not help but marvel, as I always did in these moments, at the sheer precision of Holmes's deductions. Where I had seen scattered fragments, he had seen the shape of the whole. Every detail now fell into place, their meanings illuminated by the master's light. Holmes moved now to the hearth, resting one hand on the mantelpiece. The fire at the rectory was no accident. Someone, likely Renfield or Miss Clay herself, attempted to destroy records that might contradict her narrative. But Reverend Trullo had already confided to Miss Clay, unwittingly, the existence of a letter from Beatrice's late mother confirming that no guardianship was necessary after her daughter came of age. That letter was hidden among the parish archives, and I'm pleased to say, retrieved by me the day before the blaze. From his coat pocket, Holmes withdrew a weathered envelope. This, sealed and signed, affirms Beatrice Hartwood as sole heir with no appointed overseer. The fire destroyed many things, but not the truth. A stunned silence followed. It was Miss Hartwood herself who broke it. "And the cellar?" she asked softly. "Where I was held?" Holmes turned to her with an almost paternal kindness. "You were kept there under the belief that the outside world meant you harm. You were drugged at intervals to dull your resistance. Your strength of will, Miss Hartwood, is remarkable. Without it, I fear the deception would have succeeded." Her eyes glistened, but she did not cry. She nodded once, steady. Holmes inclined his head. "All that remains now is to place these findings into the hands of the proper authorities. Miss Clay will stand a trial, though I suspect she will blame others. Renfield may face charges of conspiracy. Reverend Trullo," he paused, "will answer to both the law and his conscience." The vicar, silent throughout, merely rose and bowed to Miss Hartwood. "I ask your forgiveness," he said hoarsely. "I was weak." She said nothing, but the silence held more weight than words. At last, Holmes turned to me. "The case is done, Watson," and in that moment I saw the strange, quiet satisfaction that always settled upon him when order had been restored, when logic had cut through deceit like a scalpel. The Bluebell Inn had seen deception, danger, and fear, but now it would see peace. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The events that followed Holmes's unmasking of the truth at the Bluebell Inn moved with an eerie quietness, like the gentle unwinding of a tightly coiled spring. There was no scene of riotous justice, no triumphant parade of villains dragged screaming into the streets. Rather, justice crept forward with the cold precision of a judge's gavel striking cloth-covered oak. Miss Clay was remanded into custody by the local constable, who, though clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the case, followed Holmes's instructions with commendable diligence. Her confession, when it came 2 days later, was incomplete, but damning enough. She admitted to drugging Miss Hartwood at Reverend Trulow's unwitting invitation, persuading her that unseen enemies pursued her, and forging legal papers with the intent to claim the Hartwood fortune. She remained cold and composed through the entire process, her only remark of note being, "I did what I had to do. You would too, if you had lived a life in the shadows." Holmes made no reply to her. As for Renfield, the man broke swiftly. Brought in for questioning, he confessed not only to facilitating Clay's schemes, but also to helping stage the false attack on Osric Dane. It was he who had paid a local drunkard to sneak onto the inn's grounds and assault Dane in the night, while Dane, unaware of the true motive, believed it all part of some romantic test of his honour. Holmes, having pieced this together from the bruising pattern on Dane's collarbone and a muddy boot print left outside the window, had kept the knowledge to himself until the proper moment. "Renfield is not a criminal mastermind," Holmes told me as we walked the village green that morning. "He is merely a man of limited scruples and abundant cowardice." "And Trulow?" I asked. Holmes paused, hands clasped behind his back, eyes tracing the line of clouds over the spire of the village church. "He will not be charged," he said quietly, "not by the law. His actions, though misguided, were driven by genuine concern for Beatrice Hartwood's mental well-being. He was deceived, and when he realized it, he cooperated fully. Do you think she will forgive him?" Holmes looked at me askance. "That, Watson, depends not on justice, but mercy, and mercy is not always rational." By the week's end, Beatrice Hartwood had resumed residence at the Bluebell Inn, at least temporarily. Holmes arranged for the solicitor, Mr. Marston, to travel from London with the proper paperwork to restore her claim over the Hartwood estate. She appeared in public only briefly, on one occasion walking with Mrs. Cranley beneath the orchard's blooming canopy, and once to offer her thanks to Holmes. "You have given me back my name," she said, extending a gloved hand. "Not many men could claim that, Mr. Holmes." He bowed slightly. "Names are difficult things to steal, Miss Hartwood, but all too easy to misplace. I hope I never do again." There was no sentimentality in his voice, but I could tell from the slight crease at the corner of his mouth that he admired her resilience. As for Osric Dane, he departed as suddenly as he had arrived. He left a letter for Miss Hartwood, which she did not share. I do not believe she ever replied. The innkeeper, Mrs. Greenhollow, returned to her routines with almost supernatural calm, making no mention of the tragedy that had played out within her walls. I overheard her once remarking to a guest, "We've had our share of storms, but bluebells always return in spring." It was on our final evening in the village that Holmes and I sat once more in the drawing-room, a fire crackling gently behind us. The sky beyond the windows had turned a soft lavender, and the scent of freshly cut grass wafted in from the open sash. "You've been unusually quiet these past days," I said, swirling the last of my brandy. Holmes tapped his fingers against his knee. "There is a sadness," he murmured, "in seeing how quickly cleverness can be twisted into cruelty." He leaned forward, eyes catching the firelight. Miss Clay was brilliant, not in a loud, demonstrative way, but precise. She orchestrated an entire narrative, Watson, one that nearly fooled even you. "Thank you for that," I muttered. He smiled faintly. Her downfall lay not in lack of intelligence, but in her assumption that no one would care enough to look past the surface. Most don't, you know. They accept what is shown. They trust labels and signatures. Until someone like you comes along. He turned his gaze on me, thoughtful. Even I could have missed it, had Beatrice not resisted. Her silence saved her. Silence and instinct. The human mind is not so easily tricked when the heart rebels. There was a pause. "Do you believe she'll recover?" I asked. "In time, but not easily." We sat in companionable silence, the fire burning low, the mystery behind us, and only the rhythm of the countryside ahead. "Do you suppose," I said, "at last, there are many Bluebell Inns in England?" Holmes smiled. "Thousands! But I doubt we'll ever find another quite like this." And so ended our curious case in the village of Alderton. A tale of misdirection, deceit, and the faint perfume of wildflowers masking darker truths. Justice had prevailed, yes, but as Holmes often reminded me, justice wears many faces. We left it the next morning by the early train. As we rode away, I caught one last glimpse of the inn through the window. The bluebells were in bloom again. Chapter 18. Holmes's Final Reflection. Our return to Baker Street was an oddly quiet affair. The bustle of London, which once seemed to me a relief after any sojourn into the countryside, now struck my ears as oddly harsh. I had grown accustomed, in those last days at the Bluebell Inn, to fog-muted dawns and the low whistle of wind across the fields, and more than that, to the unfolding of one of Holmes's most subtle and emotionally fraught investigations. It was 3 days later, as I finished writing my notes on the case, doubtless to become a manuscript once I found the proper title, that I found Holmes seated in his armchair, a violin balanced loosely in one hand, and the unopened post scattered across the floor at his feet. "You've been staring at that envelope for half an hour," I said lightly. He nodded without looking. "Up. It is from Miss Hartwood, postmarked the day we left." I waited. She thanks us for restoring her name, but declines the suggestion of further legal action against Miss Clay. She believes punishment has been sufficiently meted by fate itself, a rather poetic notion. "She's stronger than I expected," I said. Holmes gave a small shrug. Survivors often are. He put the envelope aside and picked up the violin. "I've been thinking, Watson, about the nature of deception. That's unlike you," I said with a smile. "You usually think about its dismantling." "True. But this case, this one was different. Clay's plan was not born of greed alone. She orchestrated a narrative, one rooted in a genuine belief that she could create justice out of theft. The forged papers, the staged attack on Dane, the manipulation of the Reverend and the girl. It was all designed not only to mislead others, but to convince herself that she deserved what she had never earned." He paused, drawing the bow gently across the strings, a soft note rising like mist. "But the truth," he went on, "has a peculiar habit of resisting confinement. One detail, one faintly burned envelope in a hearth where no fire was lit, can unwind an entire tapestry." "Is that what first led you to doubt?" I asked, startled. He nodded. That, and the handwriting in the inn's ledger. "Clay tried too hard to vanish, Miss Hartwood. The perfect absence, my dear Watson, is often the loudest clue." I made a note of it for my manuscript. "And Trullo?" I said. "Do you think he'll ever return to his pulpit? Perhaps. Or perhaps he'll choose a different kind of penance. He loved the girl, in his way. Too much to see clearly. His sin was blindness, not malice." The fire crackled softly. "You once said," I murmured, "that sentiment clouds logic." Holmes gave a quiet laugh. "So it does, but it also sharpens motive." He rose, setting the violin aside. "Come, Watson. The world is full of mysteries, and we've been idle far too long. I've heard curious reports from Surrey. A series of disturbances at a private observatory. An assistant missing. Notes tampered with. It may prove nothing.